Thank you for joining us today. It's very different to be getting together over the virtual platforms rather than in person. So thank you so much for tuning in for our session today. My name is Martina Jelekova, and I'm the CEO of Horizon Housing. With me here today are Dr. Nick Falvo and Richard Horvath. And before Richard and Nick introduce themselves, I would like to acknowledge that the three of us are calling in from Mokinsissis, the Blackfoot name for Calgary. Horizon is located on the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi and the people of Treaty 7, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Nakota nations of Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley. Mokinsissi, the Blackfoot name for Calgary, is also home to the Métis Nation, Region 3. And with that, Richard, I'll turn it to you for a brief introduction, and then over to Nick.
Hello, my name is Richard Horvath. I am Anishinaabe from, my family is from Northwestern Ontario. However, I've lived in Calgary for over 30 years, and I'm proud to consider Calgary my home. I am the program manager for Métis Calgary Family Services Rainbow Lodge Supportive Housing Program. I've been with Métis Calgary Family Services in this role for approximately 15 years. I'm also the co-chair of the Aboriginal Standing Committee on Housing and Homelessness, based here in Calgary, and have been doing so for about 3 to 4 years now. I'm very proud to be part of this project.
My name is Nick Falvo. I'm a Calgary-based research consultant. I had the honor of being the research lead on this project and collaborating with a great group of people.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Nick. And so now briefly back to Horizon Housing before I turn it over to Nick and Richard. So Horizon Housing is a Calgary-based affordable housing owner, developer, and property manager. We own approximately 900 units of housing and serve close to 1,300 residents. We serve low-income families and individuals, including those experiencing mental health challenges and people with physical or developmental disabilities and seniors. Currently, about 10% of our residents identify as Indigenous, and they come from nations across the provinces and territories. And this gets me to why we are here today. We want to talk to you about what we did at Horizon over the last year, what lessons we learned, and what we plan to do next. So as a way of background, at Horizon, when we provide affordable housing, we expect a certain outcome, and that outcome is housing stability. So when we look carefully into housing stability and the flip side, housing instability, we found that a disproportionate number of Indigenous people experiencing housing instability are Indigenous people when they live with Horizon. So how do we know this? What we did is we looked at our negative exits, which is a jargon word for saying that people leave housing with us for reasons other than their choice. And so those reasons would include eviction from housing or lease non-renewal. So here's what we learned over the last year. 44% of negative exits at Horizon pertain to Indigenous residents. And yet, Indigenous residents account for about 10% of Horizon's residents. So these were very sobering and heartbreaking, brutal facts. And so once we learned this, we needed to keep going. And so this is what we wanted to do. We wanted to learn more about our role in this situation as a housing provider, as an organization whose vision is a city where all people have a safe and affordable place to call home, and as an organization that is at an early stage of our journey of learning and reconciliation. So we wanted to learn more about what we could and should do to change this unacceptable reality. We secured funding through the Community Housing Transformation Center. And with that funding in place, we retained expertise and we established partnerships. Dr. Falvo, Nick, and Richard are two of the leaders who shaped this work. We work closely with the Aboriginal Standing Committee on Housing and Homelessness, and Richard is one of the leaders at SMUDGE. And we also formed an advisory committee that worked with us on what we need to do. Why partnerships and expertise? We knew what questions we wanted to ask. We did not know how varying worldviews, cultures, and experiences could shape the path to answers. And we also wanted to set the stage for accountability. We wanted to declare, here is what we learned, here's what we are doing, and eventually here's what we will do. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Richard.
Hello again. I participated with this project as the advisory committee, or on the advisory committee, as an Indigenous person. And as an Indigenous housing provider, it was great to participate in this project, as we believe it to be fundamental to improving the relationship between housing providers and Indigenous persons. I would first like to recognize the bravery that Horizon Housing has taken in undertaking this project. Indigenous people have long felt as though there has been difficulty in their relationships with housing providers, whether or not this has been through lack of advocacy or through systemic discrimination throughout Canada has been a major concern. As such, the bravery that Horizon Housing has shown in researching and investigating this relationship between themselves and the Indigenous community has been essential to moving forward. Indigenous people in Canada have always had some concern with their relationships with housing providers, whether or not that's been through discrimination, lack of advocacy, or simply having the chance to voice their own concerns in from themselves has always been a difficulty in our society. The Indigenous community wants to improve their relationships, I firmly believe. And in order to do so, projects like this are essential. These projects shed light on the issues that Indigenous people face with housing providers, and these projects help to reconcile those difficulties with the Indigenous community. The findings here, while not necessarily surprising to the Indigenous community, are essential in recognizing that these are problems and that these problems can face solutions, because we want to move forward and we want to create housing and housing stability for Indigenous persons, and we want to contribute to that with all housing providers. Thank you.
Okay, and it's Nick Falvo here speaking again. I'm going to take you through the slide deck with some findings and other things. You heard from Martina about what Horizon Housing is about. The motivation, as Martina alluded to, is the fact that I had been doing some work with Horizon Housing on their outcomes. We developed a logic model and talked about how Horizon Housing should be tracking progress and what they should consider outcomes and outputs. And we discussed the high rate of negative exits amongst Indigenous residents at Horizon. We found that 44% of negative exits at Horizon had to do with Indigenous residents, yet, as Martina pointed out, just 10% of Horizon's residents are Indigenous. So that was not good. And we said, let's talk about a research project that can uncover what's behind this. So we secured funding from the Canadian Community Housing Transformation Centre. We partnered with the Aboriginal Standing Committee on Housing and Homelessness, of which Richard is a key member. We formed an advisory committee. Richard was on that advisory committee. This advisory committee was key. The committee met monthly for the duration of the project. Most of its members were Indigenous, and the advisory committee advised on all points pertaining to the methodology. It discussed everything we should do at every stage of the project. In terms of the report's method, there was a literature review, of course. Most good research projects start with reading what's already been written on a topic. It then involved 15 interviews with Indigenous residents, current residents of Horizon who are Indigenous. There were then 10 one-on-one interviews with subject specialists, mostly based in BC and Alberta. So people in the sector who knew about affordable housing for Indigenous people. It included 4 focus groups, including one just with elders. It also included a rather extensive review process. And what I mean by that is when there was a draft of the report ready, it was circulated to absolutely everybody that we thought might be willing to contribute feedback. So it was, we offered the chance to all interview subjects the chance to provide feedback on the draft. Everyone who had participated in a focus group was shown a draft. All members of the advisory committee, staff at Horizon Housing, people in the Calgary community that we thought would just be interested in this project. Several people across Canada as well who have an interest in this topic. All were sent a draft of this report for feedback. There were then draft findings presented via Zoom, and also draft findings presented at the CHRA Congress earlier this year, virtually. 10 recommendations were made stemming from this report's findings. I should really point out that most are contingent on external funding, so new funding for Horizon Housing. That's a challenge, of course. That's something I really need to underline. And also, all of the report's findings, all the recommendations involve collaboration with Horizon's partners, both existing and new partners. In other words, Horizon is not expected to do any of this alone. It's supposed to partner in an appropriate way with partners, including and especially Indigenous organizations. Recommendation number 1, there are 10 recommendations. Recommendation number 1 pertains to cultural programming. The report recommends that there be on-site cultural programming at Horizon Housing, operationalized as quickly as possible. This would require some resources, of course, but this stemmed from report findings about residents wanting on-site cultural programming. Recommendation number 2, SMUDGE support specifically. Residents talked about wanting SMUDGE support. So the report recommends that SMUDGE be a focus of some of the new cultural programming with support from elders. The report also recommends that Horizon look into the possibility of SMUDGE setting off smoke alarms and what mitigation strategies might look like. That was brought up in interviews. Smudging in a common area is also something that needs to be explored. Recommendation number 3. This will probably not surprise many listeners, an Indigenous liaison person. So several participants in the research study suggested that Horizon hire a designated Indigenous liaison person. Other terms for such a position include Indigenous advisor and cultural resource person. And this person could do things like helping the resident services team, which provides sort of social work support to residents. It could also help steward Horizon's various Indigenous initiatives. Recommendation number 3 pertains to the orientation process for new residents. Several participants suggested that Horizon enhance its orientation process for new residents. Right now, it consists of a short meeting with the building manager. However, the report recommends that Horizon consider a multi-stage orientation process where 2 or 3 meetings or more might happen over the course of several months with new residents. Such an orientation might involve elders as well, letting the new resident know that their culture is important and that culturally appropriate supports are available. Recommendation 5 focuses on staff training. The report recommends that Horizon enhance its staff training, offering a variety of learning platforms. This would be staff training pertaining to cultural culturally specific factors that would improve Horizon's ability to support Indigenous residents. Recommendation number 6 focuses on crime prevention and safety. Residents who were interviewed, Indigenous residents who were interviewed, noted that police were on site often and they felt uncomfortable. So the report recommends that Horizon consider taking an approach known as crime prevention through environmental design, whereby a law enforcement lens is applied to the built environment. Details of this approach are discussed in the report. Eviction prevention is the subject of the 7th recommendation. The report recommends that Horizon consider offering funding for eviction prevention that would support residents needing to leave their units for an extended period of time. Such funding could also help prevent evictions due to rental arrears. Recommendation number 8, additional staffing for Horizon's resident services team. The resident services team at Horizon focuses sort of on the one-on-one social support for residents. And Horizon has limited staffing on this team. The report recommends the addition of at least one other staff person, ideally an Indigenous staff person. Recommendation number 9 pertains to leadership. The report recommends that Horizon try to recruit at least one Indigenous representative on their board of directors. The report also recommends that Horizon's staff leadership team have at least one Indigenous person. Final recommendation pertains to an annual survey for Indigenous residents. The report recommends that Indigenous residents at Horizon be surveyed annually and ask questions about how they are finding life as a resident, an Indigenous resident at Horizon, how they're finding and reacting to changes being implemented as a result of this report and other work. How to access the report? You probably want to, how do I get a copy of this report? Email me, falvo.nicholas@gmail.com. The email address is right here on the slide.
So do we have time for a few more words? Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Richard. So with this, I think the next piece is really for Horizon to say, well, what do we do? Where do we go from here? And well done is better than well said. So overwhelmingly, we heard thank you for this report and these recommendations. And we look forward to what you do with them. So I want to, before we jump into questions, I want to tell you just a little bit about what we've done in the last few months since the report was delivered. We worked very closely with our board. And our board buy-in has been phenomenal and also a critical piece for the next steps that we want to take. This work was not just an opportunity for Horizon staff, but also for our board to get not just a better understanding, but also a commitment to move forward. Next pieces that we got involved in was strategic planning. And we are in the midst of our strategic plan. So the good news is that the timing of the report was such that we were able to incorporate the findings into our strategic plan, which we will publish in about a month or so. The next step will be setting priorities, identifying resources, and as we mentioned earlier, creating accountabilities through our strategic plan and through our yearly business planning process. This is where we will walk the walk and talk the talk. And lastly, this was an opportunity for first connections, but this is just a start, and we know we need to continue to deepen our relationships with our Indigenous neighbors and knowledge keepers. So we intend for this to be the beginning of a way of being for our organization with Indigenous voices as our guide. And with that, unless Nick and Richard have anything else to add, we will look forward to a discussion and we'll jump into questions. Thank you for joining us.